I'm not Ralph Hexter. I am Margie Ferguson and from the English department, and I'm standing in for Ralph, who wished he could have been here, but because I'm a member of the Provost's Forum Steering Committee, I have the pleasure today of opening today's event as if I were Ralph Hexter. This is the only event in 3 years of forums that he's missed, and he wouldn't have missed this one if he hadn't been called away on urgent university business. I know he's disappointed not to be with us to hear the lecture by Professor Wendy Brown, whose work he greatly admires. Fortunately, he'll be able to catch up by watching the video after he returns. So welcome to the sixth and final event in the 2014-15 season of the Provost Forums on the Public University and the Social Good. Don't worry, though, the series will be back again next academic year with a fourth season of forums that is shaping up to be an exciting one. And we hope some of this year's speakers might be enticed to come back for conversation. Today's program, the Provost Forums for 2015-16, 2015-16, has as our featured speaker Wendy Brown, who is Professor of Political Science at UC Berkeley. I want to move out of the way as quickly as possible, so I'm going to pare my introductory remarks to the bare bones. Today's program follows our usual format with the speaker's presentation followed by an audience Q&A period. As soon as the Q&A is over, we'll begin our reception in this room. I hope you'll be able to stay for food, refreshments, and continued discussion. As I said, this is our final forum of this academic year. Currently, we're finishing arrangements on next year's program, and we'll advertise that program by email and on the Provost's website as soon as all the arrangements have been completed. And it's on the Provost's website where you can tell your friends that they can see the video of this event today. I want to thank the 5 campus entities that have joined the Office of the Provost to co-sponsor this event: the Center for Regional Change, the Institute for Social Sciences, Science and Technology Studies, and the Community and Regional Development Program. And we offer our special thanks to Professor Brown for taking time from her schedule to give us the benefit of her knowledge and insight. Wendy Brown is what we might call a coveted speaker to the Provost Forums. Not only is she passionate and articulate about a number of important issues pertaining to the current state of higher education, she also brings to this subject both brilliance and formidable learning, including deep theoretical awareness. The fact that her work has been translated into more than 20 languages says a great deal. At a time when consensus seems increasingly hard to find, the entire world seems to agree that she is someone worth listening to. She received her PhD in political philosophy from Princeton University in 1983. Prior to coming to UC Berkeley in 1999, where she is now in the Department of Political Science, she taught at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and at Williams College. Beyond her regular scholarly and teaching activities, she lectures around the world and has held a number of distinguished visiting lectureships and fellowships. In the last few years, she's been a member of the Birkbeck Critical Theory Summer School faculty, a senior invited fellow of the Center for Humanities at Cornell University, and a visiting professor at Columbia University. Her fields of interest include the history of political theory, 19th and 20th century continental theory, critical theory, and theories of contemporary capitalism. She's best known for intertwining the insights of Marx, Nietzsche, Weber, Freud, Frankfurt School theorists, Foucault, and contemporary continental philosophers to critically interrogate formations of power, political identity, citizenship, and political subjectivity in contemporary liberal democracies. She is indeed among our most important and incisive analysts of such democracies in what I would call bad times. In Politics Out of History, 2001, she took up the challenge of explaining and theorizing how to think and how to live in a time when the classic leftist strategies seem to be no longer effective or convincing. The languages of both common life and high theory come together in this work and in all of her work. In Regulating Aversion, 2006, she performed some radical house cleaning on the concept of tolerance, one of our knee-jerk affirmative mantras, too often received uncritically, and here shown and shown up as a summary term for a good deal that is intolerant and uncivil. In Walled States of 2010, she brilliantly analyzes the reliance of many states that call themselves democracies on the fortress mentality and the building of barriers for maintaining their sovereignty. It's our great good fortune that she is with us this afternoon to bring her critical expertise and wisdom to bear on our exploration of the public university and the social good. Her lecture is entitled, "The End of the Corporate University, What We Are Now." Please join me in welcoming Professor Brown. We have the transfer of mics here. There's some water for you.
Can you hear me? Yes? All the way back there? Okay. Margie, thank you. If that was the compressed version of Margie's introductions, I can only imagine the elaborated versions. It was lovely. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I do miss Ralph. We all miss Ralph when he goes away. And I nevertheless feel warmly welcomed by his office and by other friends here at the University of California, Davis. And it's very nice to see old and new friends. My talk today is going to be, oh, that's what we're doing. Okay. Never been so over-mic'd in my life. My talk today is going to be very much oriented to faculty, and that doesn't mean it doesn't have relevance for everybody else, but it's really centrally focused on the problem of faculty governance. So I just give you that as a kind of heads up. I have other things to say about public higher education and about higher education generally in these times of transformation, but this particular talk is really oriented toward that particular problem. It's a commonplace that one of the most powerful effects of neoliberal rationality, let me just get rid of this, hold on. Okay, it's a commonplace that one of the most powerful effects of neoliberal rationality, that distinct form of reason which casts all human endeavor and all human activities in market terms, that one of its most powerful effects is to undermine the rationale for public goods and the very meaning of public interest. This has important implications for both the teaching and the research dimensions of universities, especially public universities. Exceeding while contouring privatization, continuous cost-cutting, rising student debt, this distinctive form of reason leads both students and faculty to approach university existence largely in terms of enhancing their own capital value. Conversely, neoliberal rationality is what challenges support for curriculums organized to educate citizens for democracy or support research undertaken for the public good. Indeed, democracy itself becomes largely incoherent when submitted to neoliberal rationality. When humans are only market actors, when all the world is only markets, when the ubiquitous norm for success in such markets is to enhance your present and future value, there's actually no basis for popular sovereignty, or even for the political participation we know as the modest form of voting or deliberation about the common good. Now, to the extent that many faculty are directly interpolated or organized by this reasoning, and to the extent that they conceive their activities and agenda in terms of individual or program value enhancement, and of course the ratings between the two are linked. The higher the value of the individual in the profession, the higher the program is ranked. The higher the program is ranked, the higher the value of the individual. To the extent that most faculty are directly interpolated by this form of reasoning, One way to understand the steady diminishing of interest and presence of shared governance in recent decades rests right here. Many faculty have ceased to be concerned at all with shared governance, and university management, itself increasingly oriented by business metrics, often discourages it. There is some truth here, but I think it only tells part of the story, and what I want to do is get at the rest. And then after I get at the rest, I want us to try to think together about the predicament that's produced by what I'm going to call the structural displacement of shared governance. I want us to think about the predicament that that produces for sustaining and renewing some of the crucial purposes of public universities amidst the tremendous transformations in higher education today that are incited by the combination of neoliberal reason, financialization, globalization, along with new technologies and new demographics. So to fill in what I'm calling the missing backstory about why shared governance has been structurally displaced, I'm going to explore two things at a very broad level. First, why it took so long for the university to be conquered by market rationality. And second, the entailments of this conquest for faculty governance. I'm going to argue that the frequent naming of our predicament today as the corporatization of the university actually misreads the ways that universities have been reshaped by the transition from a corporate economy to a shareholder or financialized economy. More than a misnomer, it prevents us from grasping what this transition has meant for both the governance and the mission of universities. The problem in a nutshell could be put this way. In a matter of 40 years, public and private institutions of higher learning have shifted from being governed by faculty to a form of governance contoured by shareholder value and increasingly disseminated across university life rather than concentrated in any particular body. This isn't merely the result of the economic restructuring of academia. Of course, that restructuring has occurred at every level. Rather, I'm going to suggest it's the effect of the university's transposed valuation in a shareholder economy and of the university's own awkward uptake of a model of governance attendant upon shareholder capitalism. And I'm going to explain all of this, just giving you the little précis first. So, my argument will be that while we're appropriately frustrated by a loss of public investment in university research and teaching as a public good, while we're appropriately frustrated by retrenched student access generated by ever-rising tuition costs after half a century of nearly free public higher education, while we rightly lament reducing students to bits of human capital, remaking curriculums for high-level vocational training, valuing research by its potential for partnership with industry, my suggestion is that each of these is actually a symptom of the revolutionary transformation of universities in the past 2 decades that has been occasioned by the larger transition from corporate to shareholder capitalism. All right, to explain this, I'm first going to tell the common story we tell ourselves with a kind of nod to Foucault, the story we usually tell ourselves, and then try to get at what I think is the more accurate story. So here's the story we usually tell ourselves. For a very long time, institutions of higher education were ivory towers, an exception to and buffered from the rest of the economy, its forms, metrics, and players. Intrinsic goods requiring little or no justification, universities were run like no other large institution except perhaps the church, from which historically, of course, its organization derived. University costs were barely accounted or weighed against benefits. Universities were unusually large, diverse, yet holistic operations, integrating and cross-subsidizing science and the humanities, undergraduate education, and highly specialized research, harboring on the same grounds scholarly gravitas in the professoriate and a forever young student body engaged not only in formal knowledge acquisition, but social, sexual, cultural, political discovery. Universities were governed by faculty who had neither credentials nor special aptitude for governing, who were tenured for life, and who were modestly paid relative to their level of education and social status, but perdured in the profession for its satisfactions, including a rare degree of workday independence, relative lack of alienation, and relative respect from the world at large. Students were not oriented toward higher education as consumers or investors. Rather, college either reproduced membership in the elite or was a ladder of upward mobility. A liberal arts higher education was presumed fundamental for either. This is the basic meaning of the liberal arts. It originates in the idea that it was the education needed for free persons. That's the origin of the term. And so as more and more persons became, as it were, free in modernity, liberal arts became appropriately distributed to more and more of humanity. From a societal perspective, higher education was a public good, producing the next generation of leaders and professionals, raising the general level of knowledge required for civility, problem solving, and progress, and developing the intellectual acumen required of self-governing people in a modern, complex age. Research had the value its disciplinary guilds vested upon it, again, a medieval churchly remainder, and was neither accountable to nor even expected to be legible beyond the professoriate. In short, the university was largely off the economic grid, notwithstanding its elaborate internal hierarchies, its structuring by and reproduction of class, race, and male superordination, and its indisputable role in providing knowledge and personnel for capitalist development and growth. Upon this age, the story goes, twilight fell. Privatization and neoliberalization converted a public good to a private one, placed faculty on market scales, allocating reward according to commercial metrics, cast students as educational products in the 70s and 80s, as customers in the 90s, and as investors in their human capital beginning in this century. The withdrawal of public funding and imposition of a corporate business model on universities brought an end to their isolation from the rest of the economy and centuries of semi-feudal rule by faculty. This imposition rapidly and violently transformed every aspect of university endeavor and infrastructure: access, expectations, working conditions, the ethos of learning, society's valuation of knowledge, and the historic sequestering of quotidian academic spaces and undertakings from corporate, or more generally, commercial influence. The problem with this story is that neoliberalization, while extremely important, was not all that happened in the late 20th century. There was also financialization, attention to which changes our understanding of both the history and the predicaments of our present. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to be relying heavily on a book that I commend to anyone who wants to just understand this transition at a very accessible level. It's a book by Gerald Davis, D-A-V-I-S, called Managed by the Markets. And so I'm going to be drawing my analysis to some degree from that book for the next few minutes. In that work, Davis divides American 20th century capitalism into three phases. The first emerged from turn-of-the-century Wall Street-financed mergers that turned dozens of regional producers into national oligopolies or monopolies. This was the original finance capitalism featuring control of industry by bankers: Rockefeller, Gould, Carnegie, Morgan, etc. Lasting only a few decades, this was an unstable and quite unpopular set of arrangements. Bank control of industry in particular frightened the public and pushed it leftward. And it was partly from this anxiety that what Davis calls the welfare form of corporate capitalism emerged. From the 1920s forward, that is before the Great Depression and before the Second World War, the fantastic growth and expansion of the corporation in the US was accompanied by its adoption of numerous welfare functions for workers and managers alike. Indeed, US corporations in this period tended to manage the social risks and costs, from pensions and paid vacations to health and life insurance, housing assistance, even recreation programs, those social risks and costs that would be increasingly seen as the responsibility of governments in Europe. And it was partly by taking on these functions that social democracy in the United States was averted. That is, it was partly by corporations taking on these functions. Moreover, while corporate managers naturally had to keep an eye on profits, this was not their sole or even main concern. Rather, corporate managers' own status and reward was tied to their firm's growth and expanding dominion in an era of unprecedented, and what would turn out to be short-lived, oligopolies fashioned from vertical integration. So that's the second stage of capitalism in the 20th century. The third stage of 20th century capitalism, what he calls, and I will now be using as this, financial or shareholder capitalism, disintegrates these giant institutions as it divides and outsources and offshores various operations, as it displaces managerial control of firms with governance according to shareholder value, and transforms everything about the way that successful firms are oriented, organized, and compete. The corporation itself, in this period, late 20th century, is reduced to a nexus of contracts, divested of a particular soul, and the developments and fortunes of the corporation become tied exclusively to shareholder value, both existing shareholder value and prospective value. In this way, boards of directors gain power over managers, and managers themselves rise and fall according to their capacity to enhance shareholder value. Don't worry, we're going to come back to universities in a second. It's all going to make sense. Now, our concern is with the transition from corporate capitalism to shareholder capitalism. Shareholder capitalism affects academia not simply by neoliberalizing or privatizing it, but by radically transforming its governance parameters, metrics, and sources as the university is remade in the image of shareholder capitalism. So my argument is that universities were largely organized and governed, although with their own weird inflections and adaptations, by the welfare corporate model for much of the 20th century. Universities were large, vertically integrated institutions run like little welfare states and managed by faculty along with some administrators for the well-being of the whole. What we are suffering now is therefore not the corporatization of the university, but its undoing by shareholder capitalism. For this claim to be compelling, we have to dig a little deeper into the transition. As I've already suggested, though it's difficult to fathom now, managers of large 20th century corporations were not exclusively oriented by profit, let alone shareholder value. Corporations famously satisficed. Some of you are old enough to remember learning that term in your Econ 101 class, rather than maximized value. And managers were much more concerned with and rewarded for expansion of their operations, of their corporations, than they were for profit margins, let alone stock value. Corporate executives themselves comprised a new upper class without being a ruling class. And that, of course, fascinated mid-20th century sociologists and economists as they indexed a novel separation of ownership from control, and as managers exercised immense power to shape these behemoth institutions of society. Unions were at their peak strength, and managers and workers alike enjoyed informal lifelong tenure in most corporations. Remember, one did not simply get a paycheck from General Motors, AT&T, or National Cash Register. One belonged to those corporations in a deep way. Corporate pensions, health and life insurance plans were the signature of this, as employees, from mid-managers to secretaries to factory line workers, lived, retired, and died in the arms of a single corporation. There are many reasons why this system fell apart in the 70s and 80s. Globalization challenged oligopolistic competitiveness. Vertical integration and decently compensated employees with cheap offshore labor and production. So that's one reason. Growth in productivity reduced employment across most industries. The retail and service sector, which featured none of the above-mentioned qualities, expanded exponentially. There was also stagflation and an energy crisis, and of course, above all, in the Euro-Atlantic world, the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. Now here, with this last, the usual focus is on deregulation, union busting, privatizing public industry, services, and goods. But the Reagan-Thatcher program, heavily informed by both the ordo-liberal school of neoliberalism from Europe and the Chicago School, had another vital feature. It was the challenge to managerialism with a market for corporate control. Here's how this went. Rejecting the welfare state quality of corporate management and worrying about the oligopolistic tendencies that thinkers like Schumpeter saw as leading inexorably toward state socialism, neoliberal economists identified control of a company as itself an asset that could be sold to improve performance, to stem corporations' declining competitive status, and to rescue free enterprise itself. Two reforms in particular were needed to make this happen. Managers had to be made more dependent on boards of directors and shareholders, serving rather than dictating to them, and underperforming firms had to be taken over by new managers, hence that whole period in the 80s of hostile takeovers, buyouts, mergers, acquisitions, and so forth. So the second reform, underperforming firms taken over by new managers, tended to produce the first, which was to submit managers to shareholders and to boards of trustees. But importantly, they had the combined effect of reconfiguring companies as competing for investors. Success was now going to be measured according to standing in the stock market, not the so-called real market. Thus, financialization of value in the non-banking sector was born. With it came the unrestricted takeover market, mergers, bust-ups, and above all, the end of the idea of the corporation as a social entity, one with a soul, a character, and provisions for its members. This was the end as well of vertical integration, conglomerates, and single product manufacture, where the old corporation had been a vast oligopoly and a miniature welfare state. The new nexus of contracts was lean, mean, flexible, often fleeting. My point here is not the old one about post-Fordism. That point is that disseminated global production and flexibilization of capital and labor heralded the end of long-term employment contracts, the end of unions, the end of benefit systems. Rather, the point is different. It's that financialization brought with it a new kind of governance shaped by the distinctive new management goal of enhancing shareholder value. This value is not reducible to profit, as the frequent divergence between a company's posted earnings and its stock price makes clear. Amazon, for example, can post quarterly losses while seeing its stock jump. Uber can be declared worth $40 billion, but show no profit at all. Rather, the way that a firm is valued by the stock market is determined by a great range of tangibles and intangibles. How the company's run, what it's just acquired or divested from, its perceived risk exposure, who's bidding to take it over, who its new competitors are, how its own gambles with products and pricing are regarded by the industry, what future product line it claims to be developing, what reputational damage it may have just suffered, what new market share it seems poised to acquire. Crudely put, what matters is not the bottom line, but how would-be investors regard a firm's potential for enhancing shareholder value, the value of their investment. What matters is the market's assessment of a company's future promise, which is also affected by the market moves based on speculators' beliefs or guesses about that promise. Compared to the omens and auguries that can bump a stock value, commodity fetishism thus looks like child's play today. But importantly, for our purposes, stock market valuation, not profit, growth, or long-term dominance, also determines the fates of managers and contours every decision they make. And perhaps most importantly, this form of valuation, while emanating from the stock market, has now spilled into every dimension of contemporary society. To the extent that neoliberalism economizes everything, it literally has spilled into every domain and dimension of human existence. What matters today across the board is not immediate income, but its speculative promise or value, its ranking, its rating, its ability to attract future investors based on attractiveness to current investors, hence the ubiquity of the unpaid internship, or ubiquitous anxiety about Yelp ratings or Moody's ratings, and the number of Twitter followers or Facebook likes of any startup or any student. What does all this have to do with universities? As I've already suggested, we've never been as far outside mainstream schemes of economic organization, governance, and value as the conventional story suggests. In both state schools and elite privates, academic management and governance has strongly paralleled that of the rest of the economy, and the great sketch that I've just sketched has revolutionized universities, which, as they have been privatized, have adopted both the governance practices and the values of the shareholder capitalist era. There are lots of important effects of this, and I want to just identify two: loss of faculty governance and loss of university mission, as we have come to be managed by ratings and rankings for would-be investors. As we have acquired administrators and added management sectors responsive to this world, especially in development, admissions, contracts, and public relations. And as various components of the university are broken out and sold off to commercial enterprises and venture capitalists, from Coursera to Google. As the university itself becomes a nexus of contracts. While these losses are familiar to this audience, I think refraction through the story I've just told may illuminate some new features of them. So first, let me talk a little bit about faculty governance. As I suggested at the outset, for most of the 20th century, faculty controlled the standards and set the basic conditions of research and teaching, curriculums, general education requirements, standards for degrees, and graduation. Through a combination of Senate committees, departments, and individual decisions, faculty mostly determined what and how we taught, what we thought students should know and obtain degrees for, what programs should be developed or transformed or retired. Albeit constrained by social and commercial values, organizing grant funding, research was also ours to design and to pursue without regard for its valuation outside the university. Of course, there were lucrative government contracts and corporate consultancies, and these could corrupt, but they did not govern. They were there for the taking or not. In short, faculty were the managers of what we called the academic side of the house, the knowledge developing and knowledge dispersing function of the university. To be sure, we were a distinct and weird breed of manager. We managed ourselves and not only others. That's the phenomena expressed in the notion of shared governance. But retrospectively striking is who and what had little say in how teaching and research were organized, evaluated, and rewarded. Namely, financial officers, trustees, chancellors, presidents, donors, and the public. Faculty governance was acceptable through the era of corporate capitalism, precisely as I've suggested, because it comported generally with its parameters and values. Without hostile takeovers or corporate raiding, though both online education and the new managerialism might be construed that way, this is the position from which faculty have been slowly but steadily displaced in the last 2 decades. If the empty husk of the old regime remains in the form of Senate educational policy committees, department curriculum reviews, in no meaningful sense do faculty now govern the university or their work as teachers and researchers. As new managerial layers at the top combine with circulating benchmarks and best practices imported from the commercial sector, and intersect with outsourced support services and student investee mentalities on everything from course selection to plagiarism, both teaching and research are increasingly contoured by what we could call indirect shareholder value metrics, the capacity to generate rankings all across the university, at the smallest level and the biggest level, that will attract future investors. Would-be investors in research, of course, include both private and public money drawn to research's capacity to enhance their present and future value. And investors in education are students, now rendered as bits of human capital seeking to enhance their future value. As a financialized shareholder value economy and culture generates ratings for investor calculations in everything, such ratings have proliferated for academia and govern each part of it. There are rankings of individual faculty, departments, and of course, institutions as a whole. There are rankings of graduate programs and subfields within graduate programs. There are job placement rates and postgraduate income ratings. For undergraduates, there are, of course, ratings for dining halls, housing, recreation facilities, cultural and social life. And the Obama administration plan for reallocating $150 billion in federal financial aid, according to rankings of institutions that provide the best return on investment. This will submit every institution of higher learning to a complex algorithm built from much of the above, much of the various kinds of rankings I've just suggested, plus, of course, tuition. Again, these rankings and ratings simultaneously index value for would-be investors and are themselves driven by investments. In this respect, they're both speculative and objective, but they above all represent a market radically different from one shaped by supply, demand, let alone scarcity or labor value. Along with the ubiquitous bond ratings for public institutional borrowers, states, cities, agencies, universities, these rankings govern universities by shaping practices at every level, in student ethos and conduct, in pedagogy, in curriculum design and program revision, in hiring and firing, in developing university partnerships and programs based on them, in lines of research pursued or not, in publication venues, and in our esteem for ourselves and our colleagues. Thus, shareholder capitalism transforms both who and what governs the university, as well as what it is for. It's introduced profound mission confusion into both research and teaching, and it has increasingly delinked the two insofar as they are governed by different investor groups. Indeed, the quaint faculty insistence that research and teaching are related refers to a university holism disintegrated by shareholder capitalism. But the most serious mission confusion lies in undergraduate education. Notwithstanding the persistence of the college premium, that term that simply links college to better income prospects for BA degree holders, it's unclear what kind of college curriculums enhance human capital. What is clear is that return on investment presses toward curricular compression. No dawdling over meaning or wonder for today's bit of human capital ever seeking to enhance its value. Meanwhile, a new problem opens up as students themselves become the source of instructor and course ratings. Once confidential, used primarily as information in hiring, promotion, and teaching improvement, imagine that, teacher rankings are now public, gamed, and growing determinants of what gets taught, how, and by whom. Indeed, student indifference to the status as opposed to the effectiveness or entertainment value of faculty reinforces the casualization of academic labor. A cheap young classroom talent is a better investment than a tenured teaching mediocrity for student and institution alike. Similarly, the rankings of colleges, based on algorithms weighting quantitative attributes of applicants, reinforce reliance on standardized tests, AP courses, and other widely acknowledged corruptions of K-12 education, even as high school and college personnel alike decry these measures, not simply for that corruption, but for their reinforcement of socioeconomic advantage and their poor training for college-level learning. All of us has said to a student at one point or another, forget everything you learned in that AP course that you took in order to get into my fill-in-the-blank English, history, politics, government, economics course. Now we're going to get serious and learn to think about this stuff. Where was I? So the rankings of colleges are based on a series of things that are actually often decried by college professors and others themselves. This vise was manifest when, a few years ago, one college ambitious to boost its national rankings was discovered to be paying matriculating freshmen who were already coming to campus, to retake the SAT to boost the college's ratings overall? How long before colleges induce their graduating seniors to take lucrative jobs in finance rather than social work? Why? Because it will up the college's return on investment rating and reallocate federal financial aid in that direction. This is what it means to be managed by the markets. Thus, not only have faculty been displaced from university governance by financial market metrics and managers oriented by those metrics, a deep divide has opened up between faculty standards for research and education on the one hand, and on the other, student investors and university managers themselves appointed and backed by trustees increasingly drawn from the world of business. This divide means that we would fare no better if we were to press for governance by stakeholders rather than shareholders. Other university stakeholders, families, students, managers, staff, the public, donors, share neither a commitment to the old model of the university as a corporate whole, nor the wish to restore the old managerial class, the faculty, to the throne. They have little difficulty with the fact that just as commodity production can be globally dispersed, partitioned, and rebranded, academic research and learning can be segmented, hybridized, outsourced, crossed public-private, academic corporate lines, and above all, detached altogether from university degrees and fiefdoms. Hence, it's largely university managers, and especially those outside university campuses themselves, who have embraced online education and partnered with private corporations to provide it. Last year, you'll recall, brought the news of Starbucks and Arizona State University joining forces to offer free online courses to 135,000 Starbucks employees, making extensive use, of course, of government financial aid for the project. The irony is that a Starbucks employee doesn't make enough, is poor enough to qualify for government financial aid, so it was one of those packages in which the combination of Starbucks and Arizona State figured out how to milk financial aid for Arizona State for gift to Starbucks workers. And of course, Starbucks saw its stock jump after the announcement. What I'm suggesting is that the radically reduced role of faculty governance and the mission drift in universities today are linked and are overdetermined, but cannot, as they so often are, simply be laid at the feet of privatization, or laid at the feet of corporately minded managers, or laid at the feet of apathetic faculties. I'm suggesting instead this explanation. First, shareholder capitalism changes the managerial structure of the university and the metrics by which each part of the university is measured and funded. Second, these metrics themselves affect the ethos and orientation of faculty, for whom the university is increasingly a platform for their own capital value as researchers. And it's interesting, I was just in the process of trying to help recruit a new faculty member from the University of Pennsylvania to Berkeley, and he was a lovely person and very ambitious and kept referring to Berkeley as a better platform for his work. And I realized that, of course, most of my colleagues on one level ingested this as the right way to be thinking. You think about, and on the other level, realized they were being reduced to a platform. So there's still a little bit of room to work with in there. Okay, so the ethos, orientation, and activity of faculty increasingly understand the university as a platform for their own capital value as researchers, a value, of course, that is depleted by extensive teaching duties, let alone involvement with governance. And then thirdly, I'm suggesting that administrators, even those who value consultation with faculty about select issues of policy or direction, cannot help but be interpolated by shareholder capitalist managerialism and its devaluation of shared governance. At times, the devaluations are just light dismissals. At other times, they're quite explicitly formulated. For example, last year at the Aspen Institute, former Harvard president Larry Summers said that what prevents higher education from serving students well today are the dual evils of tenure and shared governance. Technology, he went on, will force universities to either adapt or die. But, he said, since the average professor is around 50, institutions controlled by faculty tend to resist adaptation or experimentation. This generation, 50 and over, is not the one, he said, that's at home with technologies, the new technologies, and he added all the new technology companies are led by young people. So, here's the position he put us in. He said, experimentation, innovation, and adaptation, all of which are associated with these new technologies and the young, are directly at odds with tenure and shared governance. Tenure and shared governance are literally in the way of the innovations that universities ought to be undertaking. He was on stage with the current Harvard president, Drew Faust, who was a little uncomfortable with some of this, but did say, and I'm quoting her, faculty would be much happier if they spent their time on their own expert areas rather than wasting time learning about school budgets and other issues pertinent to shared governance. So, the historical conjuncture I'm suggesting, the unfortunate historical conjuncture I'm trying to lay out is this. At the very moment when universities are facing the most dramatic transformation they have faced of the past 100 years in funding structure, organization, ethos, expectation, management, relationship to state, society, and economy, faculty are structurally disenfranchised, not only ideologically dismissed, from the position of having very much say in these transformations. And I think it's unfortunate above all because at least some faculty, some of the time, have wisdom on the questions of what higher education and advanced research are for, what conditions nurture or imperil these things, and what the complex mission of universities ought to be now. We are not, as we are so often characterized as being, only troglodytes, or only careerists, or only cranks, or only arcane specialists, though each of those is a little bit of a dangerous edge to our existence. I'm suggesting that as long as we have some perspective and knowledge on what makes an educated society and a culture of research worthwhile, that the displacement of faculty from the position of governance at this particular moment is something of an emergency. So the question I want to address in concluding is not whether faculty have any hopes of retrieving their former power to govern, which I think is really as unlikely as retrieving, say, sovereignty or cultural homogeneity of nations from the maw of globalization. Rather, what I want to ask is how faculty might participate in shaping the future of the university, now that the rationale for faculty governance has been undone by the university's decorporatization and financialization. In particular, how might faculty who continue to care about the public mission of public universities, about research and education for democracy and other public purposes, how might we help cultivate and renew those values through the transformations we are currently experiencing and the inevitable transformations ahead? If not as the governing class, and if not as academic laborers simply fighting for our own sectarian interests, what might be our role in shaping universities as educational and research institutions in this century? How might we preserve universities against forces that increasingly threaten to impoverish, at an intellectual level, our classrooms and our labs, our graduate programs and our research, our collegiality and our creativity? And how might we preserve them against the threat of imperiling, I guess I would put it this way, the future of civilization itself when an educated citizenry is needed so very badly? How might we protect the non-financialized value of learning and research, along with public access to it, that is now being challenged, if not bulldozed, by shareholder capitalism? So I spy two possibilities here, and in naming these, I'm probably going to piss off everybody, but that's what you come to do a talk to do, I suppose, sometimes. So one possibility is to take up what I'll call the structurally weak, but perhaps symbolically potent position of Tiananmen Square's Tank Man, or Palestine's Rachel Corrie, or Tunisia's Arab Spring fruit seller. What do I mean? Displaced from substantive governance, we can become protesters against various developments that threaten to degrade the university's public and intellectual purposes. And I think this has been the character of much faculty activism over the past 2/3 of a decade, taking shape in ad hoc petitions and protests, channeled through our faculty associations, through Christopher Newfield's invaluable blog, and so forth. But the problem is, very few faculty actually have the spine and humility for this kind of activism, where there's no presumed deference to our status or to our gravitas, let alone our historical claim to the throne. And for that reason, this kind of activism is also very easy to marginalize and dismiss, both by administrators and by other faculty, put off by its non-institutional, antagonistic, and seemingly undignified character. At least that's been a substantial part of my own experience working with the Berkeley Faculty Association. The other approach reckons with the paradox that neoliberalism's strong anti-democratic force, it's what I started out by talking about, its economizing mode of reason, its replacement of shared with managerial governance, and its tendency to reduce everyone and everything simply to concern with capital enhancement. That anti-democratic force may require some non-democratic forces of governance or resistance. I don't mean Leninism or Maoism or authoritarianism, so stay with me for this final turn and I'll try to explain. Configured as it is by neoliberal rationality, and more specifically by the metrics of shareholder capitalism, democracy itself, including its institutional form in academic senates, cannot be counted on to preserve and renew the mission of public higher education. It can't be counted on to care about educating for democracy or conducting research in the public interest. Just as democracy at large can't be counted on to sustain the institutions that it actually requires to survive, but is perfectly capable of abandoning, defunding, or deforming those institutions, whether by empowering corporate capital as lobbyists or campaign funders, or by divesting from public education at the very moment that capable, informed citizenship requires enormous amounts of social, political, cultural, economic, literary, and historical knowledge. Indeed, this is the situation of neoliberalized democracy today, spurred by diminution of everything that does not convert to capital value enhancement, and spurred by the encomium towards self-investment and self-reliance rather than provision through the social. The public has disinvested in higher education across the board and has done so democratically. It has withdrawn support from higher education as a public good, and it's increasingly skeptical of higher education as a private good. So, if we cannot count on existing forms of democracy, either inside or outside universities, to preserve their value against the economic rationality that's undercutting it, perhaps we need guardians, stewards, trustees of public higher education, just as we have stewards or guardians of the wilderness and the arts, of endangered species, cultures, and resources. Perhaps we need a body that stands apart from the markets and the metrics that otherwise imperil these things. Perhaps we need something supervenient, with its eye only on the problem of how to nourish unbought research and an educated citizenry. How would this go? Such guardians or trustees, whether taking shape as councils within governments or within universities or both, could not be representative committees or stakeholder groups or policymakers. Members could not be elected. They could not be appointed either according to their corporate or financial status, their prominence on Wall Street or Silicon Valley, as most university trustees and regents now are. Rather, they would have to be selected on the basis of their established concern with the public mission of producing an educated citizenry and research for the public good. And they would have to hover near the center of power without themselves being in power, available to corruption and interest. They would, as Plato had it, have to be those least desiring to rule. Such trustees of public higher education might work by considering every significant proposed development or change to higher education policy and universities through the prism of its potential effect on education and research for the public good. These kinds of developments, things they might be concerned with, could include tuition and financial aid formulas, reorganized curriculums or degrees, reorganized or outsourced staffing arrangements, compression of time to degree, major partnerships with corporate donors, radical budget reallocations, new assessment instruments, contracts with MOOCs, and more. Anything could be brought before the trustees, but by anyone, but only one question could guide their analyses and deliberations. Does this proposed policy, or divestment, or restructuring, or new set of relationships tend toward the enhancement or the diminution of the public mission of universities, especially the aim to generate an educated democracy and enable research in the public interest? Now, of course, this is not the only important question to ask of proposed changes in state education policy or local university priorities, but it's critical enough that the answer ought to have a certain prominence, if not supervenience. Most importantly, this kind of a question, currently absent from almost all debates and developments concerning the future of higher education, might by this means come back into public discourse. Of course, there would be many practical and political objections to such a proposal, starting with how guardians would be chosen, the violation of shared governance and democracy that such a council represents. To this, I would only repeat, shared governance within the university is now so weak, and more generally, democracy is now so trammeled by market meanings and practices that it's incapable of preserving an educated populace, just as it's incapable of preserving the arts or guiding us toward a sustainable planet. Indeed, that trammeling is part of what's brought us to this pass, as the demos itself, the people, increasingly ratify practices and conditions by which the demos is disintegrated as a demos. So we cannot leave the public good to democracy thinned to market desires, conduct, capital value enhancement. Rather, we need a conservation agency, one that might parallel environmental impact reports with public higher education mission impact reports. Or to switch the metaphor slightly, one that understands the public purposes of public universities as so severely endangered and which, once extinguished, may be gone forever. As to other objections, they're so numerous that this proposal will probably never get to the runway. Democrats, anarchists, and autocrats would all oppose it, as would free marketeers, academic freedom purists, and rational maximizers in every field. And then there are the vested interests and powers. Within universities, such a body would surely be opposed by faculty senates, by administrators, and by regents, by all faculty and students who care mainly about market positioning, and alas, by almost all unions. While generating this unholy alliance of opponents may perversely underscore the importance of such a body, it probably also dooms it to the status of a provocative idea offered in an academic forum one spring afternoon. But at this late point in the game, it still may be our best hope. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Brown, and she is now willing to entertain your questions. So, or arguments, yes.
Joe.
So I don't have any disagreements with your analysis. But I have a question that I don't understand anyway, how to get to the answer, and it's related to your last suggestion. So let me make a comment about that first. If you look at the state constitution, the UC regents are set up very largely, at least the language of it, is similar to what you're proposing. And that the regents are supposed to manage the university as a public trust, And there's mechanisms in the Article 9, Section 9 for the appointment of the regents, which would, if followed, have a chance of producing a board of regents that looks a lot more like what you're proposing than as a conservation agency than what actually exists. In spite of that, in spite of the fact that it's the supreme law of the state, it's routinely ignored by the governor in making appointments with complicity from the legislature, in particular, Senate Rules Committee. So that's a comment, but it's connected to my question, which is your analysis is kind of an explanation of what has happened, but if it has in it a explanation of why it happened, I missed it. Why did these changes take place? What are the forces that determined that that was going to be the outcome? If we don't understand that, we don't really understand much about what transformation might be possible in the future. And my last comment is kind of trivial compared to those. I have an issue with using the name shareholder capitalism, and that it seems to sound, by a choice of words, vaguely democratic, which I think your words of market or investor would be a lot closer, and that actually that most shareholders have no say at all, and the power is concentrated in a tiny number of people on Wall Street. So I'll shut up there.
Okay. I'm going to have to hold this to do this. Okay, great. So let's start with the regions and make our way to, well, let's start with shareholder capitalism. It's the term that is used, and I spent a lot of time talking about it to suggest indeed that it's anything but democratic. And usually stakeholders are understood as the democratic alternative to shareholders, because shareholders, as you say, are not all, I mean, it is all shareholders, but when you have one vote, one share versus a billion, you don't exist. So shareholders not only govern in a sense of quite literally through voting in relationship to corporations and companies, but more importantly, as a process of investing. Shareholder capitalism really refers not to the shareholders, but to being managed by the markets, to the question of what happens when you shift from a world in which corporations are run by managers to generate expansion, growth, some degree of profit, to a world in which corporations are themselves controlled by markets determining their shareholder value. And it's the shift from product and profit to financialization. So but you know all of that. So you're right that the term is not ideal if it's not explained. I'm not big on well, I'll leave it at that. Okay, so regions. You're, of course, right that the whole idea of the regents was to be trustees of a public institution and to look out for it as a public institution. And probably one could say many things about why the trustees didn't go that way. One thing, or the regents didn't go that way. One thing I would add to the usual things that are said, which is simply that they're political appointments and they reward donors. Is that one of the perversities of California in particular, as you know, Joe, is that being a regent is considered one of the most plum things you can be in contributing to election or re-election of a governor. And this has meant that the reward for contributing heavily to gubernatorial campaigns is regental appointments. And it's ironic because most of the regents don't actually care or know much about the details of public higher education. They just want to be hanging out in this especially august domain. And it's useless to us as something as a venue for renewing or redirecting the future of public higher education in California, because it has nothing to do with people who actually know what peril the university is in right now or understand the peril at its deepest substantive intellectual level. So you're absolutely right that what I'm suggesting is something apart from that, and I'm suggesting that it is quite literally a substitution for what has gone so off the rails in the form of the Regents. It's not like the Regents were ever free of a monopolization by wealth, by market orientation, by but the extent to which the combination of let me put it this way, California's success in real estate, in Silicon Valley, and in other areas has produced a set of regents who literally are those folks. And the combination of that with the press to marketize and financialize universities has made the regents, I would put it really bluntly, essentially enemies at this point of the effort to try to preserve what's worth preserving at the University of California. So we have to, I actually just think we have to give up on them and think about an alternative institution. It doesn't matter how guaranteed it is by the Constitution or what the mission of the regents is. We now have a system that's so deeply broken that we need something else in terms of renewing the possibility of public interest and a public good. There was one last thing you said, though, that I wanted to say something about. Oh, the why. So I tried to give you the why really quickly, what the accident was that actually produced a world of financialization that exceeded just the world of banks. I don't want to rehearse it again now, but I partly think that we don't need, let me put it this way, I'm not convinced that we have to have the account under our belts of why it happened in order to understand what world we're in now. I do think I do think why it happened is fascinating, because I don't think it was inevitable. I don't think finance capitalism and financialization of everything or neoliberalization were inevitable features of capitalism. I think they came about through a set of convergences and even some accidents. But they are what we have now. And it's not that if we had the answer of exactly how they came about, we'd know how to roll it back and take them apart. I think we have to approach the question of what to do with what remains of public institutions in the context of both a neoliberalized world, a world in which public value and public goods are radically diminished, and a financialized world, a world in which what matters is ratings, rankings, and enhancing capital value rather than just direct profit or return on investment. I think we have to reckon now with those as we think about how to preserve public goods, public education, and educating for something besides job training in public universities. I'm sure that won't satisfy you, but yeah, you can say one thing, and then there's somebody behind you.
On that, yeah, I totally agree. The regents have run off the rails in spite of what the Constitution says. But I'm interested in the why, because
the why they've run off the rails?
Well, I think the reason they run off the rails is similar to the reason that we're.
I think it's a little different. That's what I'm trying to suggest about the regents. Is that?
Let me finish.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
The question is really not to claim that the regents can be resurrected, but how can you set up some kind of conservation agency, for lack of a better term, that would not also run off the rails like the regents have?
So this is why I was hedging it with all of these different things. It can't be democratically elected. It can't be representative. It really has to have one purpose, and that has to be its purpose, and it has to be built from that purpose. And what I'm drawing on here, since I also work now on climate change, is an increasing understanding that if we look either to markets or simply to experts or simply to democracy, we are not going to be able to let's just put it really basically, we're not going to be able to sustain this planet through the 21st century. We have to figure out some other bodies that are not autocratic, that are not dictatorial, but that call the emergency into public presence at every turn that the planet is in. And I'm suggesting that these new forms of governance that recognize that what we want to do, what we might long to do through democratic means, we can't do when democracy has been so deeply corrupted by neoliberalism. But at the same time, we can't simply turn our backs on it. So I'm looking for ways to develop bodies that could bring the problem into prominence, not empower them to the point that they could destroy what remains of democracy, but at the same time not simply make them yet another exercise or shell game in this and that stakeholder who bargains away this and that piece of the thing. So it's open. As I said, I want us to talk about it. That may not be the right road to go down, but I don't think we'll succeed in rehabilitating the regents in time to preserve public education. I don't think that we'll be able to get the California public to not only to reinvest quickly, but to rise up and say, oh yes, I want a liberal arts education for my daughter or son, because that does regenerate democracy and give us another shot at governing ourselves and make the whole person, and so on and so forth. I don't think we're going to get it from the public. I don't think we're going to get it from the regents. I don't think we'll get it from our managers. I don't think we'll get it from faculty who are mostly now fully interpolated by the world that I've described. Most of my political science colleagues spend most of their time looking at the rankings and ratings of their books themselves, their worlds, their journals, their publications, their conference venues and so forth, to sense where they are and where their colleagues are and where they might be, and they are not particularly interested in the question of what to do with the public university. But I think the public university is really worth trying to renew and regenerate for the next century, and to renew and regenerate with a public mission and with a quality of education, curriculum, and research that will be different from any other century. But, I'm saying this to you because we share these values, but I'm looking for the body that might do it. I'm not, as you can tell, completely convinced by the one I've cooked up, but I'm not convinced by the other alternatives yet either, the other available alternatives, and I don't want to give up. There's a woman in the very back. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, Suad. Hi. I don't have my glasses on.
I am in equal parts, found your presentation breathtaking, depressing, and inspiring in equal parts. But I'm also I can't help notice a paradox here, that you are giving this lecture in the Provost lecture series. You could equally have given this lecture in the Chancellor's lecture series. And I've attended a few of these, and there have been other presentations which, interestingly, like yours, are actually offering an analysis counter to the very thing that we are doing in the universities. So I'm looking at that paradox. How is it that you speak in the Provost Lecture Series or Higher Administration Series, and speaking a profoundly shattering critique of the very practices that we have actually engaged in, whether it's a new budget model, whether we're all driven by student credit hours, whether every week we get new rankings for departments. By the way, some universities have gone much further out in this than we have. I have colleagues at Yale where each faculty member has a number that they're ranked by, and they're either depressed by that or elated by that. But the idea of reducing.
And of course, Britain takes it further than anybody.
Yeah, yeah. It's global. I've got
Right.
colleagues at the American University in Beirut, and they get numbers also.
Right.
What I'm wondering is, given this paradox, that we still have speech.
Yes, we do. We do.
There you are, speaking in the Provost Lecture
Yeah.
Series, and there's no way that one can listen to your talk and not see it as a critique of precisely what we're doing here. That's a good sign, right? Where do you see the spaces for the kind of activism that can, let me back up a little. I liked a lot what you said earlier. This was not inevitable.
Right.
There were moments where it could have gone, where the changes, financialization and so forth, could have gone in different directions. And one has to hope that there are still moments, that those, which is why you still don't give up. Otherwise, if you thought there were no more moments for us, you would be home.
I would
doing
plant my
something else.
garden.
That's
Yeah,
right. You would be in your
exactly.
garden. You'd be in
Yeah.
a glass of wine, whatever. So we're given that paradox of yes, we're still talking about this,
Yeah.
right? And in very high level, with very high level authority.
Yeah.
Where are those moments? In addition to that particular proposal that you made, that can be engaged by students, by faculty, by
Great.
staff, by academic federation. Where are those moments?
Wonderful.
And what kind of coalitions do they take?
Yeah. Okay.
So I don't have all, I mean, this would be, again, something that would be really interesting for us to think about together, but let me first address the paradox. One of the things I was hoping to make clear is that the idea that individual administrators or managers or development officers are responsible for our predicament, I think, is simply mistaken. And what I'm trying to get at is what we used to call a discourse, which I think is more usefully talked about as a rationality, a whole form of reason that organizes us, that we cannot really escape. We can look at it critically, and I'm going to get to the question in a moment of where those moments are that we might disrupt it. But I do think that it's brave of Ralph to say, let's have this conversation and let's have it be open, and let's have people come in who have all kinds of different views. I don't know how many different views there are among those who have spoken, but let's have this conversation, and let's not be afraid of it. And let's not even be afraid of it if I'm off signing a deal with China that is part of the very thing that, is whatever. I mean, that was at least the joke Ralph made with me when he sent me the email explaining the predicament. So I don't think it's, I'm trying to depersonalize it for all of us so that we don't get so defensive about it at a personal level and finger point at a personal level, and instead understand the organization of reality that this rationality produces and the conditions of existence that it sets up for institutions, for individuals. There's probably no place any of us sees it more vividly than with our graduate students, who often arrive passionate about the particular subject that they've come to study with us or in our programs, and in no time at all, because of the tremendous scarcity in a future professoriate and in the world they wish to enter, learn how to entrepreneurialize themselves, enhance their capital value, game and scheme and so forth, and feel miserable about it as they do it, because they literally go from that moment of raw intellectual passion about the work to recognizing what it's going to take to produce themselves, to build their resumes and produce themselves and enhance their value. So I think it's not so much a paradox that I can speak here about the things that we are all engaged in doing, as it is the condition of our existence, and as you point out, the fortunate condition of university existence, that we remain available in some quarters, not all, but in some quarters, to critical inquiry into the who and what that we are. And it is only in some quarters. There are, as you know, many parts of the university that are quite closed to such a conversation and simply understand themselves as doing what they need to do in order to achieve those rankings, ratings, and so forth. And I think there are increasing pressures for all of us to become like that, to shut up and sing. So one answer to the second part of your question, I think, is right there, that it really does remain important, I think, for us to be able to acknowledge complicity without it turning into personal guilt, while making the scene that we're in an object of study and an object of, in some cases, resistance or transformation or experimentation or creativity. And there are many different possibilities. I think there are lots of different, as you say, possible coalitions and possible spaces, but I do notice that each time a genuinely intellectual space is opened up on campus among a small group of faculty and graduate students, an exciting moment in an undergraduate class, where suddenly that question, let me put it this way, the excitement about intellectual inquiry, transformation, development, collaboration, and so forth displaces some of this other nonsense, that it's actually quite powerful. It's extremely powerful, especially if it's acknowledged and underscored. And what I find, I'm sure many of us do in our classrooms, is that we're constantly dealing with, especially in large undergraduate classes, students who are thinking about the class as nothing other than an instrument to the next rung on the ladder and so forth, and that they're sometimes caught by surprise in their intellectual excitement. And then that's the moment, I think, to teach the problem that we're up against. Now, the last thing I would say here is that some people have more of a stomach for this kind of, you called it paradox, I'm calling it complicity, being both subject and object of the problem at once, being able to have a certain reflexivity and critical engagement with it and look for possibilities to experiment, to transform, to resist, even while knowing it's never going to be pure, it's never going to be complete, it's never going to be deeply and totally satisfying, but we might make some headway here and there. Some people have more of a stomach for that than others. And so I think we also have to recognize that some people really hate cognitive dissonance. And I feel like a lot of my social science colleagues, since that's where I hang out, really don't want that dissonance. They really want it neatened up. Either we're going to, this is either a monstrous world or we're going to get on the train and go with it. And it's hard to sit in this other place. But other people, and here, this is where I think the humanities are actually, one of our best, I want to call it sort of substantive and deep allies in this work right now. I feel like the humanities are better for this. That's the place where as an art of thinking and learning and knowing, these kinds of tensions are often nourished rather than suppressed. So, maybe that's a space to think into. Last thing I want to say is my experience with undergraduates these days is that most of them hate being reduced to bits of human capital. They hate it. They do it. They're in it. They're always on it. They've been building their resumes since they were 3. That's how they got to these places. And they do it in all kinds of ways. But every time they find themselves doing civic work in order to, build their college application, or charity work they don't really care about and they feel hypocritical, or every time they find themselves, kind of smarmy and awful about grades or taking the shortcut on an essay or something like that, every time they find themselves preoccupied with their own rankings and ratings and futures in this way, and if they're given the language for it, I find that the resistance to it is right there. It's because it's an awful thing to be reduced to that, and to be compelled and I want to say almost coerced by this order of things, even as, of course, they can't completely opt out. So I guess I also think that's a place to work. That was long-winded, I'm sorry. Yeah, please.
2 points. One is that I wasn't at all personalizing, but was bringing that paradox of bringing up the highest possible authority one could, and yet those spaces are precisely the spaces one looks for these kinds of possibilities of transformation. I was also going to suggest 2 things. One is that I think it's not accidental that I fully agree with you that humanities is a place where these kinds of conversations and this kind of discomfort are not only tolerated but welcomed, but it's not an accident that they are the least resourced, least funded, most overworked, have the highest proportion of teacher to student, I mean, the whole bit. And they're sinking, they're drowning, they're barely surviving.
Yep.
And we feel this especially at a university that's a very science university.
Yeah.
And the last point I want to make is, I do think the hope is in the undergraduates, because they're not yet, at least many of them, have not already made that professionalized commitment and decision. And both their disgust at some of the things that they see, their resistance, their rejection, sometimes noisy and uncomfortable and unpleasant to some folks, is that place of not yet being formed by the things around them that allows for possibilities. I just see a whole lot more hope at the undergraduate level.
I
in many
agree,
ways.
and they need to see it affirmed
Absolutely.
Among us. One more question, yeah. Frank.
I have about 10 questions.
Okay, you're going to save them until we have cheese and crackers out there. Hi, Frank.
Hi, Wendy. Two sentences. First, you're allowed to speak in these things, the kind of words you do. Many years ago, Herbert Marcuse called repressive tolerance. And even some centuries ago, we were the jesters of the high courses. So being in a repressive place and speaking out is obviously not contradictory. But I agree with everything you say, almost, but with one point I disagree vehemently. I don't think the system is broken. I think the system works. It works because otherwise it would not work the way it does. So what I see in your analysis is a curious combination of a structural analysis of the system, which I agree with an idealist coda. It shouldn't be that way. But I think, to put it very shortly, this system produces exactly the kind of people it needs for its functioning of a highly stratified society, of a highly equal society. If the people who are not well enough trained in this country, you buy them, because this country is still rich enough to get them from other countries, so it works. So therefore, I don't think there is an internal logic to do something about the university system as it is, independent of that. I'm happy to join you and Joe and others to protest and do something noisy, but it will not change the structure, again, because this is how it is set up.
So, the problem is, Frank, I completely agree with you. Of course the system works. The part of it, there are little bits that are problematic. Having to do with a public that continues to desire what it imagines to be the access and the benefits of a public, high-quality, higher education system that is increasingly privatized and unaffordable if there's no public investment in it. There are things like that. But in terms of what I think you're suggesting, which is a shift almost entirely away from the liberal arts toward high-level vocational education centered on the STEM fields as well as business, law, and so forth, a shift away from generally educated middle class to a very narrowly trained class of sub-professional and professional workers, as well as uneducated wage laborers and occasional laborers, an education system that is increasingly organized as a business, and simply really as even an arm of business in terms of, trying to calculate and titrate what's done in universities in relationship to what's needed in the labor force. It is no accident that Mark Yudof, when he was first trying to respond to the radical defunding of the university in the early part of the aughts, or the mid part of the aughts rather, simply said this is the human capital machine for California, and wasn't saying it in a snarky or sardonic way. So I agree with you that it works. So then I take a little umbrage at being called idealist, because I spend a lot of time not being idealist. But I want to step aside from the fatalist idealist or structuralist idealist binary to suggest that the part that I'm counting on, and here I'll go back to Marcuse, is that there is something remaining in some parts of this generation of humanity that wants more. And Marcuse, of course, imagined that what you could do was tap into human desires for deep satisfaction, love, happiness, and so forth, rather than simply the satisfaction of a commodity world. I wouldn't go that far. I think that he did believe in a kind of essential humanness that I think can be extinguished. But I do think that we are complicatedly constructed, not just by one rationality, but by many. And I do think that there is unevenly distributed, but nonetheless present, in this generation at least, the yearning for certain kinds of things, not necessarily education, but certain kinds of gratifications and certain kinds of, let me put it this way, certain world, including planetary survival, but also including the possibility of connection, beauty, satisfaction in work, and so forth, that is not guaranteed by what you called the system working. And I think that's what I'm looking to when I'm looking to the possibility that there's enough people still, and inside the university and outside of it, still invested in the idea of a democratic citizenry, one that's educated for democracy, research in the public good, sustainable existence and wildernesses, infrastructures that are shared by all and not simply available to those who can pay for them. That those things, yes, they're being rapidly extinguished as values, as general values, but that doesn't mean they've been eliminated entirely from the yearnings or the psyches or the active intellectual desires of everyone. And that's all we can work with. So I'm not saying we'll prevail. My picture is always, in my study, extremely dark, but I have tried to learn not to go and stand in front of people and at podiums and just rap out that fatalism, because I don't, then all you have is the so-called satisfaction of the analysis. And at this age and this stage, I don't think that's enough.
I think that's a great point. Thank you.